Okay. Well, good afternoon. After the lunch break, we are back here, hopefully without the noise which marked the previous session. I'm very happy today to discuss more about some core topics of the participatory democracy, especially about social movements and political trust, lessons to be learned, as we name this session. I would like to present today our panelists here. I'm happy to greet Dirk Lawrence, representative of delegation European Union to Serbia. Actually, it is important for us that you are here from two reasons, or three reasons. Two are connected to the project which we are running. One of them is actually closing with this conference, which was financed through Erasmus program. And in this panel, we are presenting results from another project, which is Horizon 2020 program. So it is really great to host you here. And also it's great to have you because delegation of the European Union supported our citizen assemblies, which were implemented 2 years ago here, first time in Serbia. And we consider you as a partner and friend in this attempt to raise awareness on the potentials of participatory democracy here in Serbia. I would like then to greet Vukoslava Crnjanski, who is coming from CRTA, also a very important civil society organization here, which I dare to say sometimes has much more research done in this area than we do. So we are setting some standards, and some of them were presented this morning by one of our colleagues who is also working for
one of our shared colleagues.
Yes, exactly, shared colleagues. So thank you for accepting to be today with us and speak about this topic. Then Ivana Anđelković, she's actually the member of the Roof Over Our Head initiative and the person who helped us a lot in doing the study which we are presenting. We felt that it would be really right thing to do to invite some of those who are like object in a way of the study also to act as a subject here when we are presenting the results. So thank you, Ivana, for being with us today. And on the other side, we have Rastislav Dinić. Well, actually, we two had here on behalf of Faculty of Philosophy, University of Niš, but also one of the, I would say, well-known activists here in Serbia. Thank you for being with us here. And finally, Vedran Džihić from the Center for Advanced Studies Southeast Europe, University of Rijeka, from Institute for Democratic Engagement Southeast Europe, from Austrian International Affairs Institute. I mean, many heads he has, and I don't know which one is the one you are taking here, but thank you for being today with us. And we are going to give you a small introduction into the topic, which was based on the results I already mentioned of our Horizon 2020 project. And I'm giving the floor to Irena Fiket, my colleague and PI in this research, to start with presentation.
Okay, thank you, Gazela. She already presented me, and today 3 times I presented myself, so I think that's enough. Like in the previous case, I will go through this much boring part of the research results. As you can see on the power, this is uncomfortable because I need to look at. Okay. This is the research we done. The Gazela is mentioning enlightened trust, examination of examination of trust and distrust in governance, condition, effects, and remedies. I will just briefly explain the research methodology. This is the we did a comparative research with different universities based in Czech Republic, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Italy, Poland, and Serbia. What we did is that we had 2 focus. Our empirical data were collected through the focus groups. We did 2 focus groups, one with core of the movement, core members of the movement, one with followers, with 2 social movements in each participating country. It was very difficult also in this phase of research to identify who are core. This is something we should reflect on. Who is core, who is follower in the social movements. Ivana maybe could also give us some comments on that. It's not easy to identify, but for us it was very relevant to somehow find those who are let's say, involved more or deciding more than those who are just activists who participated in the actions that are initiated by those who are core in the movements. We did our field research between March 2021 and May 2021. Here also it was not very easy, but we identified some criteria for selecting the sample of social movements, and this is that they must be, we decided to focus on democratic social movements, not on, for example, right-wing social movements. And that was that they possess democratic character, and that they're inclusive and non-discriminatory, and that beside the specific issues, they're focusing on, like, for example, environmental issues or some others, that they also have a broader scope, that is that they want to democratize society in some kind of way, in citizen participation. And then that they are active in the moment with the research and have the record of public activities at least 6 months prior to our research. Let's go to the next slides. And these are our cases. I will not read them. We can give you, who is interested can ask us for this first report of the findings we did. But also here you can see some, if you look to the numbers, for example, if you look to Germany, we were aiming to have at least 5 to 6 members of the focus group for each focus group. But for example, if you look to in Germany, the second movement, housing movement, we didn't manage to have more than 3 of the core members and more 2 than the followers. This is a problem for the research, this is a methodological problem, but on the other hand, that shows you, I think this is very relevant also for the topic, because this shows how difficult it is to approach the social movements, and depends on the way. For in our case, we already knew people who are activists, and we were lucky for that, and in some way managed to involve people in our research. But in the case of Germany, they never did the research with the social movements. Social movements didn't trust them. Italian case, we also have some problems. Italians tried with 2 movements before the one they choose here, and they refuse to collaborate because they identify them as the public institutions, and it's talk a lot about trust and distrust. This is why I'm underlying this here. And we can go to the third slide. And these are our main research questions, overall research questions in this work package. What are the social movements' understanding of internal democracy? What are the preferred models of democracy, and what are the possible pathways to building it? How does the movement build relations with citizens and other social actors? What are the social movements' perceptions of experts? How much do they trust different actors in society? And what are the social movements' general attitudes towards the role of trust and distrust? And how could the social movements help to restore trust in institutions at the local, national, and European levels? We will try to provide you some answers to these questions through this presentation. Of course, we cannot stay here for hours. We will try to go briefly to this. And this is the first questions we were asking to explore the structure of the movement. And as we saw, this is in line with the familiar literature, that the majority of the movements are organized in decentralized structures, and that actually they consider decentralization, horizontality, equity, inclusiveness, deliberation as a core values. So they actually functioning in the way the other political organizations are not. This is, I must underline that this is only the core general attitudes towards that we register in the focus groups. There were discussion, but the majority of the group, the majority of the individuals involved in the group discussions expressed those attitudes. Core groups in the social movements are merit-based and practice-based. This is something we can also discuss if we talk about decentralization. And then on the other side, we still have core groups, and that somehow they are taking the decisions. Then the agency within the movement is usually on any member to propose, while decisions are made on the level of the movement in the core group or with smaller movements in plenary sessions. And this is also something like trying to find balance between efficacy and democratic values. Membership can be described as conditionally inclusive, although when we speak to the movements, they usually say that they are open to everybody, but of course there are some conditions to be fulfilled. And then the last slide, my last, democracy and engagement. You can connect to the previous slides, how they perceive democracy, internal democracy. They also reflect those values to the other parts of society, and this is how they think society should be organized. They think that we need institutional change towards more direct participation of the citizens, where the act of voting actually may begin to make sense again. The society democracy could not be only electoral democracy. We need more participation. Democracy is not the ultimate object, but the process where participation should be more direct. Then we need to focus on the process of involving the citizen in political life overall. And this is something we already discussed today. We need to speak more, we need to debate more, and then the vote should be the last thing we should do. Institutions should do much more to reach out and involve citizens, so they think that institutions must do something more. They cannot just observe all this, what is happening, this lack of trust in the institution. And social movements are valuable actors that are able to make citizens more visible and powerful in the public and political spheres. Active participation in the movement could be considered as an empowerment and pathway to citizens. So they're actors that are somehow between the institutions and the citizens, and they can be mobilize citizens more. And now I will, Gisela, this is your...
Now we go to the central topic of this project, which is trust and distrust. It was really interesting for us when we actually analyzed these findings which we got about their perception of trust and distrust. I would just first mention the case of Serbia, because that was something which we had to explain over and over again, and that was posed to us from our northern partners. How come that you always talk, your representatives of your movements always talk about distrust? They never mention trust. Mm-hmm. And I guess this is really very difficult to understand. Why is it such if you're not living in these countries of southern sphere of Europe? And I wouldn't say that is only the case in Serbia. It's very similar in Greece, it's very similar in Italy, although there are different circumstances and different, obviously, state of democracy in those countries. But in general, what we found is that trust is important for society. We all build all our social relations, and we build our institutions. We should build our institutions of the trust, which is something not happening in some countries, obviously. It is necessary preconditions. It is necessary for you to join any actions, to get engaged, which is something Irena mentioned. It is important to observe social movements as channel for engagement, but in order to engage, you need to trust, not only to others, you also need to trust to yourself that you are able to do something. So this is all something which we found through this, this research. Trust is really important for representative democracy, and we all see and we all know indicators which are showing that there is decline in trust in institutions primarily. And we know that in our region, for example, the most trusted institutions are very, I mean, I would say, I don't know why, but it's army and church. So political institutions, when we come to the presidents and parliaments, they are always the lowest on the scale of the trust, which is definitely something which initiated our interest in this research and initiated our interest in why and how social movements, which are obviously managing and succeeding in to induce some social engagement, can do, and how we could observe them. It is important for mobilization, as I said, so citizens will join social movement only if they trust them, and that is what we research, how much they trust and how much they see that they are trusted by the citizens. Distrust is often described as a negative, but also there is a difference between general distrust, so, I mean, distrust is not good. But some critical stance and something which is healthy distrust, not trusting everything which you get, is something which is seen as very important for society. And it's somehow it's connected to what we see as a check and balances or watchdog function of the civil society. So you need to check, you need to really stay informed and be critical about everything which is served to you. So this is very, very interesting and appears here also. When we discuss, and this was important part, about cooperation with governmental institutions, NGO, civil society in general, it is clear that cooperation with governmental institutions is something which is, well, necessary evil, let's say like that in most of the cases. So it is instrumental. We need to cooperate with them because why? We are trying to change something, some policy or some practice within institutions. So in order to change it, we need somehow to address those institutions, and that was clearly mentioned. But this is also something which causes polarization among members of the movement, because if you are getting into some cooperation with institutions, then you can get corrupted in a way, or you can be perceived as one of them, which is something really, really important, especially in the southern countries which took place, which participated in this research. And usually let's say the most useful, or I would say the most necessary level of cooperation is on the local level, where there is no way you can do something if there is no local institution which is being addressed. On the national level and on the European level, there is no basically trust into the institutions, so they are refraining from cooperation. They see themselves more as a pressure group towards institution. When it comes to cooperation with non-governmental organizations, the situation is a little bit different, but I also have to say that many of these movements which took part are also registered. In our case, for example, almost all are registered as NGOs. So we try to separate these traditional NGOs, let's say like that, from the social movement, and then to try to research how they perceive each other, or how they perceive cooperation and what is useful or not with them. This is very common. It depends on the case, but usually it's based on shared values, so they enter into cooperation with those civil society organizations, NGOs, which share the same values as they do, and usually is perceived as beneficial. So if they manage to cooperate and do something together, that usually increases trust on the both sides. When it comes to trust in expertise, that was really interesting for us to see, to observe what they think about us in a way. Basically, there is a high level of trust in expertise within social movement, but they're also very cautious. It depends. In environmental movements, and there is a lot of them in our sample, that is absolute trust. So they know that they cannot advocate for anything when it comes to environment without any data. So there is necessity for expertise in those movements, and very frequently those experts are also part of the movements or cooperate very frequently with the movements. When it comes to other movements, expertise is valuable, necessary, but also there is very vocal expression, or they vocalize that they are also the source of expertise. So movements which are doing very specific works, very specific job around, they possess they know practices, they know what is happening in the field, and they know how to address what is necessary to change in different laws, for example, in order to change these circumstances which are making their life or the cause which they are founded of more difficult. So they consider themselves as the expert. And I think this is really valuable and really important for us to understand that there are some areas where those who are members of the movement and who do not have formal qualification, let's call it like that, they also possess very valuable knowledge which can help in changing the policy, in inducing some changes, and we have to include them if we are heading that direction. Well, basically on all these findings which we presented, there were several recommendations which we thought of. And these are 5 of them. Basically, we need to broaden civil society, understanding of civil society in order to include these grassroots initiatives. I think this is something which is already happening in many understanding of civil society. They are already there. But when we are discussing civil society, we usually, in policy making, we are directing our efforts toward organized civil society or traditional civil society. And as I emphasized just a minute before, there is a knowledge and there is expertise within social movements group, which is really valuable for understanding the needs of the citizens, which we need to address. Also, citizens are feeling more powerful, and they get engaged if there is around some organization or some initiative, a movement which is open, which is inclusive, and where they feel their voice matters something. So it's important, this what Irena emphasized in the beginning, these values which they share, values of deliberation, of openness, and equality. This is something really important for all those followers of the social movement, because they feel this is something different than usual practice in political party, usual practice in NGOs, etc. So they feel welcome, and this is something which we need to take into consideration also when we're thinking how to support democratic engagement of the citizens. So social movements also have significant capacities to attract citizens which have low level of trust into state institutions. So basically they are somewhere bridging, or they are this factor which we sometimes and very frequently miss when we try to address institutions. Institutions do not include citizens, and there are, of course, there are countries where this is much better situation than here in Serbia or in Greece, etc. But in general, they feel this interest or inclusion of citizens is not genuine. And in the movements, they feel that they really can do something through the movements, and that's why they have trust into the movement and not trusting institutions. So we need somehow to also take this into consideration. Finally, from this practice, their own practice, which they praise as very good, and these values which they praise as really, really good, we can learn something about how our institutions could work and how we can reform our institutions in order to feel them more welcome, in order to feel them that when they address institutions, they can feel something, they can direct their need, they can express what is their interest, and they actually, those institutions of the future, of the near future, I hope, they should be more open for participation, for deliberation, for openness, and also for accountability. Obviously, all these 4 things which I mentioned are very difficult to implement in hybrid regime as Serbia is. So this is something which is the ground of polarization, it's the ground of political battle here, but still, this is a model which maybe can be a model for organizing in a way and taking it further as a characteristic of a desired model in our countries. Social movements also can be used as example of restoring trust in science, in evidence-based expertise, so they use it, especially, as I said, in environmental movements, and the way how they approach information, the way how they approach the knowledge they get, and how they produce the knowledge is also a model which is could be really inspiring and respectful. And today we had one session which was discussing about how to connect, actually, how to bridge academia and on the margins of this conference, how to bridge academia and engage citizens in a way, and this is a way. So we need to gain their trust, and they need to use our expertise where they can for their own benefits. So this is something which we always need to take into consideration. So these are the recommendations and presentation of our research. And now I would like to invite our panelists. I mean, you can go by order whichever you would like. We didn't plan to go by some specific order, so please feel free to comment on what you have heard, and then we are going to open the floor for also the questions from the audience.
Yes, I can start. Is this working? Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event, which I like a lot for several reasons. One is that I have some academic background myself, but it has been a while that I was involved in research. It's always good to interact. And I also have a civil society background, not social movements, but civil society in a bit more narrow sense. So it's also interesting for me to see how the discussion and the movements are developing. And last but not least, I also have a family member who's involved with one of the organizations we were interviewed, but she's not one of them. So there's no conflict of interest here. Clearly, there's a certain fatigue and lack of interest in representative democracy across Europe. And you have selected a couple of relevant countries. It would be made for discussion, also be interesting to see why some others were not included. So I have France in mind, for example, with their very strong social movements as well. So against this background, I think it's a very important, valuable program, but the research you are conducting, as you mentioned, it is supported by the European Union, but it does not mean that the content is our content, and I do not necessarily subscribe to everything what I read in the research and saw today on the screen, but I think that's good because that provokes maybe a bit more of an open discussion, and I would like for that to congratulate the research team and the citizens involved who took part in this project. Among the elements mentioned, I think what struck me most among the features is this preference for non-hierarchical and inclusive forms of organization, the favored flexibility in defining membership and internal division of labor, and the broad agreement that trust is important for social cohesion, even though, as you also mentioned, critical thinking remains crucial for a well-functioning society. What is, of course, a bit scary is the mentioned level of distrust and the implications this might have for the future of democracy. And really, I can only invite all of us to think hard about remedies, how to change this picture and establish a higher level of trust among citizens and institutions. And I'm not just talking about Serbia here, we're talking about the broader picture in Europe. As we also mentioned in reports on all of our EU countries, but also the upcoming country report for Serbia, again, it's a yearly tradition already, that we refer to an empowered civil society, also in the broader sense, which is a crucial component of any democratic system and should be recognized and treated as such by state institutions. And I hope that this project really hopes to contributes to promotion of innovative practices, perhaps for grassroots organizations or movements, but also their interaction and involvement. I also noticed, of course, the elements on the European level, which were probably not the most favorable in your research, and show that there is a lot of homework also for us to do in the EU institutions to take this forward. I think there are elements where we have a natural, even joint agenda. When we look at environment, I think our Commission and the Vice President in charge, they're really teaming up even with social movements at the global level when it comes to climate change and such questions, but it might not be the case across the board, and we have to reflect how to broaden this kind of interaction. Is also not always easy, because I would argue that a social movement per se is not per se a good thing. It really depends, as you encourage critical thinking on government and institutional policies. I would also encourage critical thinking on social movements and their agendas and their policies and their background. So in my view, it's not black and white, even though I have lots of sympathy, of course, with the general idea of social movements, in particular against the background of a research where you have also made certain assumptions at the beginning as to whom to involve and also whom not. So I hope also that the process of the conference on the future of Europe will help in this regard, where the Commission has also invited grassroots participation. We also opened up the debate to the citizens of the Western Balkans, last month I was handed over also a document, a set of recommendations compiled by the Ministry of European Integration with recommendations coming from Serbia. And I hope that even though it was not easy at the beginning to open up this process also to future member states and their citizens, not just to limit it to the existing ones, that Serbia and Serbian citizens will have their voice as well as other future member state citizens in these so important discussions on the future of our continent. And the President of the Commission has also promised in her speech that she will try to identify resources and time in order to enable all the relevant organizations, but also movements to make their voice heard in the framework of the citizens' dialogues. I hope that this will translate into concrete action and bring results to help also increase the level of trust in the European institutions, but also at all levels. I think at the local level, naturally, it's easier, also in view of the lack of a real European public, which is also still to be formed. And if you don't have the public, it's difficult also to find this sort of interaction. But that's also all among the questions we should address, not only here, but also in the framework of the Conference of the Future of Europe. And I can assure you that we as the EU delegation here locally, we are open to all sorts of interaction and listening to different voices within the limited resources we have at our disposal. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'd like to thank you once again for the invitation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this overview. And I just want to maybe re-emphasize once more after your intervention. We specifically chose to work with democratic social movements. So we are very much aware of the danger of those who advocate non-democratic practices, let's call it like that. But we choose to work with these because we somehow believe that knowledge which we produce and distribute, and hopefully distribute much more publicly than only academic community, that can help and can influence some, let's say, social processes. So we wanted to help with understanding how democratic social movements work and how on what premises they base their work in order to support and maybe stimulate some others in the region to follow the path. And it was also interesting to me because you mentioned European processes. When we started with this project in 2018, still there was not so much activities on the European level when it comes, for example, to citizen assemblies, to democratic innovations. They were on the national level, on the local level, but not so much on the European level. Now it's really like, it's becoming almost a mainstream to think and to discuss about citizen assemblies, and we see it on the also conference on the future of Europe is actually one very wide and maybe extensive and long, but in a way it's an open deliberative process on how European Union should look like in the future. In these movements, on the local level, and that is also, of course, understandable, but somehow it has to be, we have to be aware of it. European Union is not mentioned at all. So you never get anything about European Union unless if you specifically ask, directly ask. So that is something which we need somehow to take, because European Union used to be a big player in Serbia, at least, you know, you always refer to European Union and what we need to do in order to aspire, as an aspiring country, to European Union citizenship or membership, but not anymore. And this is something which changed in many countries. I think this disillusion with European Union is something which is also feeding in different ways social movements which are maybe not democratic. So this is something which I just wanted to bring it. I mean, we are going to discuss also a little bit later, but it was a reflection on what you said somehow. But now I also invite the others who would like to say something. No, by the order, Lucas. No, he is pointing at you. I'm not.
Well, I was like, okay, I can continue, and then I guess maybe. So, well, really thank you for inviting me to this discussion and to this conference. And because honestly, I was like thinking to run away from here, or like it would be really better to sit among you, because you inspired me so much this morning, and then with this presentation, I'm just like showing you my notes, and now I have so many thoughts on what we heard, and especially this morning discussion. So especially because CRTA's focus is on citizens, and almost every time we are so much disappointed with participation that in certain way we are also, you know, like in a way losing trust in any possible change if we talk about functional democracy. And now when you talked about deliberation and participation, I think I realized how much we lack actually deliberative processes within our work. And we thought, and I'm sure, you know, like when I go back to CRTA, that we will say, yeah, we are really good in this. But actually we're not. And I'm really inspired with all discussions, especially because, you know, like when we see ourselves, and I really don't want to go into, you know, like this therapy session of CRTA's work and myself. But maybe it's good to do a little bit of self-reflection, because we in CRTA see our work as, you know, like on democracy, as a combination of supply and demand side of the work, you know, like working with citizens and in the same time working with institutions, trying to actually rebuild or do something in order to make this democracy more functional or open for citizens and citizens' participation. And all things we actually do are set in advance. We think we know. We believe when we talk about democracy, it's all about the parliament, elections, and media. And CRTA's focus are actually on parliament, elections, and media. And any tool that we provide to citizens is actually not used enough. I mean, like, we can't talk about big numbers. When we open, you know, like Parliament, as we have this initiative called Open Parliament, we this year are celebrating 10th anniversary. We published at the beginning almost 200,000 speeches of MPs in this machine-readable way, believing that, of course, media will use civil society organizations, academia, but citizens will use it. And we are so wrong when we do now 10 years, you know, like reflection or assessment of the usage of Open Parliament Initiative. Someone would say, well, Open Parliament Initiative is a really big thing. And yes, we have so many researches and so many data, and the frustration is actually about that we do sit on so many data that no one uses. And it's not put into the, you know, like, function. So, I mean, like, and if you would ask me now, yes, of course, there is a huge need to cooperate, you know, like, between social movements and civil society organizations, someone like CRTA. But it's also about this trust or distrust, because I'm really happy when I see that that social movements that you mentioned, and through this research, there is openness of this cooperation, but we actually didn't recognize so much of it through our work. And as CERTA always do, I would say, or people, we do start from us, what we do wrongly, what's wrong actually with us. And it's actually about this, setting the agenda in advance. But then I was again thinking, inspired with your presentation, it's not that we don't want to open, but we can't talk about this without having the context in mind. And with this deep polarization in Serbia, we are actually, and with so many attacks on CERTA's members' work and so on, I do recognize that we, are closing for some, external inputs or, yeah. So it's actually about, finding additional capacities and resources in order to actually gather and join this, big numbers within social movements. But also, I think that what you found out for academia or expert community works for us as well in civil society organizations, and that actually that academia can help us in building this gap and then making this joint effort in making functional democracy, or especially toward the institutions that are, I would say, in Serbia almost completely closed for participation. And as you said several times, we actually are facing capture institutions. So I will stop here, and I hope I open some additional thoughts for discussion.
Let's go a little bit with this side of the table, and then we're going to come back.
Okay, then I just wanted to listen first to Professor. So it's good. No, thanks a lot for the presentation, for the great study. And I just want to make basically a few very general remarks, probably pose certain questions. I came yesterday late night to Belgrade, and then I woke up at 5 to finish an essay on the question of war and the future of Europe, having in mind the events in Ukraine. And I read a small booklet by Agnes Heller on utopian and dystopian horizons of Europe, and then she goes into literature and philosophy and back and forth. While listening to you, and while also listening to your inputs, looking at at the level of the European Union, and thinking about trust, I basically came to a conclusion that we live a dystopian moment right now, at least in Southeastern Europe and partly in the European Union, and that this dystopian moment is exactly based on distrust, but also then on fear and then polarization, as you underline, this moralization of the discourse, we and the other, and then this kind of a whole paradigm. So, and when we conclude that we live the dystopian moment, then the question is, what has happened in the meantime with the trust, and how can we restore it? And I think first very important moment that we sometimes miss in the debate, that we have a totally new landscape of trust, which means that the usual notion of democratic trust, interrelational, interpersonal, horizontal, vertical, etc., that this is probably a child of this end of history, liberalism, 90s, 2000s, which we still stick to because this is our child. It started walking, then it falls down, and then we support it a bit. But in a way, this child has entered a playing field where we have a different other, also quite a big child in the meantime, which is called authoritarian production of trust. Or minefield, I mean, it might be minefield, but then they have to fight in a way. And I mean, when I say authoritarian production of trust, that points basically at the fundamental character of what we have now in Europe nowadays. I mean, and partly the European Union. I mean, Hungary and Poland now, under different circumstances, are basically illiberal or semi-authoritarian, competitive authoritarian regimes that do manage to fight and to gain legitimation of the population by providing security services, wealth to particular parts of the population, to clientelist circles, etc., etc. And now we have it. I mean, we have it as almost something set in stone in the Western Balkans, partly. I mean, Serbia, Bosnia, right now, some other parts of the region are basically right now lost in this dystopian movement, in this competition between this authoritarian production of trust or particular production of trust and democratic production of trust on the other hand side. And this is now, that brings me to the question of legitimation. I mean, if the authoritarians are able to get legitimacy, to produce legitimacy, to have the surplus of legitimation, and then we enter the arena and also try to create, like you do with CERTA and with parliaments, and like the European Union does with inputs from outside, investments, etc., etc. Then the question is, who is able to produce more legitimacy right now? In Serbia, it's the authoritarian legitimation that is winning right now, including soft repression, pressure, control, all other types of instruments. Now comes the question of, I mean, what's the role of social movements to be played in that particular context? And I think there is something very valuable about social movements, pro-democratic social movements, which is this horizontal production of trust. I mean, this horizontal production of trust, and we have, Gazelle and I, together with European Fund of the Balkans, we have the process of Engaged Democracy Initiative, where we had a convention in Belgrade last September with 100 activists. We have thematic meetings right now. And this is where we do create a lot of horizontal trust. So they just meet each other after Corona, they hug each other, some of them even kissed each other, which is also quite good. No, it's important. But no, I'm just kidding. But the point is that through common actions and struggles, you can probably produce much more trust than the institutional setup of this dystopian present that we are caught in can produce. And this is perfectly fine. Now comes the question, obviously, first of all, how the others, like the far-right movements, are also producing that horizontal type of trust. I mean, we have to face it. I mean, the anti-vax movement in Germany and Austria has produced a lot of horizontal trust, a lot of horizontal trust. They stick to each other, they have common struggles, common actions, common frames, etc., etc. I mean, this is part of this kind of a competition going on. But now for us, like a crucial perspective, as you also included some recommendations, I mean, still from this old time of end of history, liberalism, we go towards a certain goal, and we have produced policy recommendations to have a better and nicer democracy, which is questionable. But nevertheless, then the question is how to translate the horizontal trust into vertical trust, and where to try to create and get allies. I mean, I obviously see some allies in some of the political parties. I mean, but guys from Možemo produced in Croatia is a new type of translating the horizontal trust into this vertical trust over state institutions, local government in the city of Zagreb, etc., etc. And this is, I think, an important avenue to go. The second question is obviously the trust that you, Gazella, mentioned into academia, into media sector, etc., etc. This is, I think, where we have to put a more emphasis. But now I come to fundamental moment, which is intrinsically inscribed into our story of end of history, potential end of history for the Western Balkans, and that is the European Union. And now comes basically the biggest challenge and the biggest question. I mean, if 2022, Serbia belongs to 10 most autocratizing states in the world, according to all research, and if at the same time Serbia is one of the front runners of the EU integration, then guys, we have a problem. Then, I don't know, we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. Brussels, we have a problem. I mean, this is not because of Brussels and because of the European Union only, but it is also partly because of the European Union. I mean, then we could open up a new research for I mean, what's the contribution of Angela Merkel to stabilization of Alexander Vučić and Serbian Progressive Parties? It would be very interesting. It would be very bad for the European Union and for Angela Merkel sitting on somewhere in the coffee house enjoying her pension in retirement. And this is, I mean, this is fundamental. Because now we are at the watershed moment of the European history. And we are not sitting here like in 2017 or 2015 or whatever. I mean, it's war in Europe. It's a global competition between autocracies, democracies. And now comes the big question, because our point is not to bash on the European Union, but to try to see and to create a new momentum in this kind of a process of connecting this horizontal trust to the vertical trust by, I mean, by referring to allies, because the European Union is the utmost pro-liberal ally that we have. And now coming to conclusions and recommendations, I think we need, first of all, like some kind of a big bang. I mean, we need a huge shift from what the European Union has been doing and has done so far in countries like Serbia, Bosnia, etc., etc., etc. This big bang has to include clear red lines. When the authoritarian trust of production of trust starts, then you have to stop it and close this kind of a cycle of delegitimation of democratic practices and institutions coming from regime side. And then I think there is an obvious need to connect to these kind of a pro-European emancipatory movements, democratic movements, fighting for whatever, that are basically, unfortunately, not even mentioning the European Union when they fight. I mean, at this convention in Belgrade, for 2 days, no one mentioned the European Union for a single time. Not a single activist out of 100. And that has to be basically turned around. And this is a kind of a huge process. And now I'm obviously, again, in this end of history, liberal hope that there will be a kind of a nice future for us. But I mean, going back to Agnes Heller, if there is no utopian future, they are not us anymore in what we do. So basically, these are my few remarks.
Thanks a lot, Vedran, for very interesting remarks, I would say. Would any of you two would like to continue? I know that you can lean on what Vedran said.
No, definitely. Yes, it was very inspiring, and I agree with many things that Vedran has said, especially about Angela Merkel. And I remember I once read, every time when I'm at the Institute, I remember stuff connected to this history of praxis philosophy and so on, which is a part of this tradition, right, of the tradition of the very institute that we're in today. And I remember reading an interview with Milan Kangerga. It was, I'm not sure, it was, he was already very old, obviously, and it was in the 90s probably. That's when he died, somewhere in the beginning of 2000, something like that. And they were talking to him at that point. He was already disillusioned and disenchanted. For people who are not familiar, Kangerga was a part of this kind of alternative philosophical, alternative socialist movement, alternative Marxist movement. He was critical of authoritarianism and so on, but he was also kind of optimistic about socialist possibilities and possibilities of Yugoslav socialism especially. And but then in his old age, he became kind of disenchanted. And I remember reading, he said something like that, and something like this. He said, we were naive, and he was especially disenchanted because of what happened with the nationalists and with the breakup of Yugoslavia, right? How nationalists took power so easily, right? And he saw it as some kind of falling back into some kind of tribalism. And he said, we were naive, we were kind of a utopian, we believed that we are able to produce socialism before going through some kind of bourgeois society, right? And we didn't see that what we did was basically opening up the situation for a return of tribalism, for a kind of more primitive social form. Now, I absolutely do not agree with this kind of cynicism, and I don't agree. I don't share his kind of disillusionment. I don't share his opinion of Yugoslav socialism either. But there is a kind of analogy which I'll try to make clear now with the role of social movements. I'm also optimistic about the role of social movements, but sometimes I'm kind of afraid of the role they're doing. For instance, at several, and now I come to your research. At one place you say, at several places, you say it in different words, but there is, this is like a typical formulation that activists see social movements as a necessary complement to mainstream democratic institutions. Now, it might be that in Denmark, right? Mainstream democratic institutions are doing, representative democracy is doing its job, right? Dirk mentioned that there is a lack of trust in representative democracy, like it's not good enough, right? But we don't have representative democracy in Serbia, right? We only have a facade democracy. It's not working. So what I'm afraid of is that you also mentioned this danger of co-optation, right? That movements can be co-opted by mainstream institutions. But is it the same in Denmark and in Serbia? Co-optation in Denmark is basically, you're leaving your radical thoughts behind, your utopian dreams, and you understand that, the mainstream democracy, you understand limitations, you have to work in the borders of institutional activism and so on and so on. But in Serbia, what you're being co-opted in is not mainstream institutions. You're being co-opted into a kind of mafia state, right? Into a kind of kleptocratic brotherhood. Right? This is a problem. You're being co-opted by this kind of world of shady individual deals, right? Personal dealings with the government. That's the problem, right? And here's another. So you mentioned governmental institutions and kind of different attitudes that different activists have toward working with governmental institutions. But the biggest problem in Serbia, the biggest sower of distrust in governmental institutions in Serbia is, of course, the government itself. And there is only one person who is actually worthy of trust. That is the message we're getting. And that is, of course, the president, right? All the other institutions are not worthy of trust. They're just toys to be toyed with. And so this is the problem. And this is why the situation is then more complex. There is one question that I couldn't find in your work, in your research, and I think that in Serbia it is very pressing. How do you deal not with governmental institutions, but with the oppositional actors, right? With anti-governmental actors, but which are a part, or used to be a part of mainstream politics, right? Now, in Denmark, that obviously makes no sense because parties in government change. But in Serbia, it's not so. Mm-hmm. And this is a very, in my experience, I would like to hear Angela's experiences with that. In my experience, this is one of the biggest challenges of being an activist in Serbia. Because on the one hand, you have one binary opposition that is between mainstream parties, that is the government, and the opposition parties, and yourself as an activist. And on the other hand, you're together with the oppositional parties, right, in a fight against the mafia state, or against the captured institutions, right? So this is, you have like two distances to make, and they often work against each other. Then there is another thing that I wanted to mention. Yes, you talk about different ways that activists see politics and how they see movements as kind of reinvigorating for politics and so on. But in Serbia, there's this famous phrase, and we all know it. Everyone who watches TV, right? It's completely cool to go to protests. It's completely cool to organize protests, to organize movements, protest movements, and so on and so on. Under one condition, that they're not political. And political means you're not going to stand for elections. Other than that, everything is fine. So this is a problem, right? And this is in my experience, one of the main challenges. When you mention how activists in Serbia see, actually I wanted to ask for a clarification on one specific note. This was a very interesting formulation, and the words you used actually change the meaning. You say in Greece and Serbia, few participants felt the need for radical change in order to rebuild society. Now, is it few as in a small number, or few as in some, quite some number, right? This is a very different meaning. So is it like a minority?
That's very connected to what you previously said.
Yes.
In Denmark, Germany, Poland, and Czech Republic, there is very much present that social movements are actually the corrective of representative democracy. Yes. But in Serbia, very much, of course. I mean, Serbia is really like outliner in this. We understand, I guess, why. In Greece, also very much after experience with crises, there is really leaning towards this, and a little bit, I would say, in Italy. So these southern countries really have this. We would really like to start over again. All over again. But we cannot. There is discussion around it, because discussion was led mostly about. We would like to do that, but it's not realistic.
But
it's not realistic that we can expect that will happen. And because it's not realistic and there is no end of history which is positive, then we need to stick with what we can do.
To stick to small goals.
Exactly.
Right? Local goals and so on.
Exactly.
Here's another problem. The best way you can achieve small goals is to make individual deals, personal deals with people from the government, right? And then when I say the government, I mean party in government. Party and party are parties in government. So these are some challenges that I see. Basically, in one sentence, I would say that I'm afraid, or at least one sort of pressure that local and kind of informal activist groups are open to is that instead of being a complement of democracy, they become a substitute for democracy, for representative. And this is one of the ways, of course, that the authoritarians are buying their legitimacy. But we're constantly, you're proposing dialogue. We're constantly in dialogue. We're constantly deliberating with different social actors, right? There's only one thing. They can never stand for elections. And we must always be government. And other than that, it's great. We're all for dialogue. Come, let's talk. Maybe you'll even win something, right? So this is one of the biggest challenges that I see. And this is something that I saw missing in this research, which was otherwise extremely interesting. Of course, for obvious reasons, right? If you're comparing Denmark, Greece, and Serbia, there are simply some things which fall out of the picture, right? But I would simply like to know more.
You can read Serbian report only. Maybe you will give.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to say that you can. There are detailed. I will send you just the short version in order to.
Yes,
and I'm very happy that you read it all and underline all the time. But immediately I will send you the whole report with all country reports in detail. But I think that's important. It's important. We were also surprised we were doing with these differences between, for example, that you mentioned Denmark and Serbia. Huge differences in how they perceive government. We were shocked. We were discussing and preparing for the fieldwork. We were really shocked on different topics, like how you need to approach them, how they perceive the government, how they perceive the institutions. And it's exactly as you said. But I think what I also wanted to add within the movement, also in Serbia, there are many differences. There are focus groups, what are the problems, and focus groups. But I think Ivana could help us understand that a bit more.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Ivana from the Roof movement. We're an anti-eviction movement. So for you who do not know the context, I wanted to clarify this. So I think that what would be very interesting for me is to know why people trust any social movement better than the institutions. And I think that it would be quite valuable for the next phase of this research to see why they trust right-wing movements as well, because some of you already mentioned this, that people trust the vaccine movements, or I don't know which ones. There are loads of groups of this kind in Serbia as well. And I think I know at least part of the answer. My hypothesis would be that people see social movements and someone who is directly interested in their own issues. And they see us approaching them, and we come one day, we come tomorrow, we come again, we come again. So we do not make fake promises. We're really there and we really talk to these people. Whereas their touch with, their contact with the institutions, I think, is when someone knocks on their door and says, you need to go out of your house. And why is that so? It's because you are forced to go. And you, even if you have a right and you do not know about it, or even if you know, you do not have the power to win this right. And it's because you do not have the money. So the people in Serbia live with around 300 euros per month average salary. You cannot afford a lawyer, you cannot afford to gain your rights in any way. And I think that this is what people know, this is what they sense, but they cannot really express it. I think that they voted for the change because of democracy. And now they see that this is just a facade, as some of you already mentioned. So they see that the hypocrisy of the institutions. So, for example, if a woman is forced out of her home, a social worker comes and says, I will take away your children if you do not leave the flat. So it's a fake institution. It does not serve their rights. It does not help them. And I think that people do not know which way to go, which way to look, and they trust people that come to their protection, such as the social movements. Even though I am against anti-vax movements, or I don't know, they have some support, they have some, they approach these people's fears, and these fears are, I think, rational in a way. This is not just due to their lack of education and them being pre-modern, or I don't know what kinds of things we tend to hear. So I think when it comes to the European Union, people have lost trust because these institutions some of them were brought here by the European Union, for instance, the bailiffs. So this is part of us joining the EU, and I think that people see and feel, maybe they cannot really explain it, but they see that this democracy exists for some part of the society and not for everyone. When you asked about the opposition and the ruling party, I think that their programs are more or less the same. I think that people know that change is not going to come that way. And this is why they vote the ruling party. So I was in the countryside 2 days ago, and the person who was supposed to be evicted, just because the bailiff could do it, they knew that the person does not know their rights, that they're defenseless, that they would not resist in any way. He told me, I voted Vučić because I thought that this was my only chance to protect my home. I can do as much as earn my wage, which is really low, and I don't know, pay my debt and renew the house that hasn't got even a toilet. But I have to put all my hopes into this person, and I hope that this person will protect me in the end. So the roof led to the European Union as well to rethink the law on enforcement at one point. And you know what we were told? That the head of the EU delegation was out cleaning the riverbanks. And when we came back there tomorrow, there was no reply, no reply, no reply. And I wanted to ask maybe if you can do something about it, because we really think that we need the support, and we really need the right to housing and social and economic rights to be protected, as well as functioning bailiff system and so on. So maybe you can come to the next eviction, if not cleaning the riverbanks or something like that. Maybe you can join us in this struggle and make democracy in Serbia a democracy for everyone, really, not just for the elite.
Thanks a lot, Ivana, for this heartly explanation of what you are doing, and we are really well, this was one of the reasons why we turned to democratic social movements, because many of them are working actually for what you said, for not only like political rights, but also for social, economical rights, which are very much at the stake, not only in Serbia. I would say this is the common problem nowadays. Now we had a round, and I don't know if you would like to comment on something, or if you feel you could add something, I would be really happy to hear you. If not, maybe we could open the floor for...
Happy to open the floor, but at some stage I would like to take the floor once again.
Would you like now?
I think the EU was mentioned.
Would you like now? Please.
It should be inclusive, so maybe first we let the audience also take the floor, but if you dare to give it to me, I would be happy.
I will give you all in the end one more briefly, because we have like 15, 20. We started a little bit later, so we have 20 more minutes. Please feel free to ask some questions, whoever you want, about the research. Carlo, yes?
Thank you. I wanted to react to the intervention of Rastislav Dinic. One of the things that you were mentioning, and rightly so, is this increasing distrust, or very strong distrust of social movements towards political parties. And of course, I mean, this is something that is, I wouldn't say it's very exceptional in Serbia. I think it's a very global phenomenon. However, when we talk specifically about Serbia, I mean, yes, social movements maybe have to rethink and reflect on their relationship to electoral strategy and party politics, but also political parties, at least those that have been established over the last 20 to 30 years, have to rethink their relationship to organizational democracy. I think social movements are simply adapting to the fact that they feel that established political parties are not responding to democratic will within society. So in that sense, I maybe wanted to hear your thoughts on what you see is the role of political parties in changing this kind of dynamic, and do you believe there is space for change in that sense? Thank you.
Let's see if there are any more questions to collate them. If not, no. You feel free to answer.
Thank you. It will be a very short answer. Thank you. It's a great question, and obviously I didn't say enough on the role of political parties. The establishment parties, the mainstream parties, have a different. I completely agree with Ivana. They, at different points, have shown themselves incapable of engaging people's needs for many reasons. One of the reasons is this kind of ideological hegemony, right, which they share with the ruling party. At least many of them. On the other hand, social movements, what is the way to get out of this? So first, what I wanted to say is that social movements, the situation of social movements in Serbia is more complicated, or more complex than one in developed, so-called developed democracies, right? Because they have this kind of they're in a double bind, right? They not only have to avoid being compromised are co-opted by the government, they also need to avoid being co-opted by the opposition parties, right? And both pressures are serious. So it seems to me that the solution is, on one hand, very easy, very simple, but on the other hand, not an easy thing to do, and that is to consolidate social movements into some kind of serious political actors, which is discouraged in many ways. We can read that in this research too, by the government itself. By these phrases, right? You can ask for anything, until you can protest anything, until it's political, right? Just don't stand for elections. And this is the kind of, and this has a lot of effect. In my experience, people really are afraid. Not only afraid, they develop a kind of disgust, not just distrust, disgust towards electoral politics. And so my answer is, you really have to go for both for social movements and for electoral politics. I don't think anything can be changed without electoral politics. I hope that's
Okay. Okay, if there are no more questions, then I would give the final round to the panelists and we can close it. So please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the interesting and sometimes for me at least provocative this discussion and comments.
It is difficult to speak on behalf of the European Union, I have to say these days.
No, I'm happy to speak on behalf of the European Union because I truly believe in the European Union and the European Union future of Serbia and Serbian citizens. Obviously, we have sometimes a different starting point. As a delegation representative, I somewhat represent the European executive, and in the first place we do engage, of course, with the state authorities and state institutions, which is normal in international relations, and also with Serbia as a candidate country, the presumption is that the institutions are mature enough for that sort of dialogue. And there, for us, maybe the picture is a bit different than the picture is for many of you who assess the overall state of affairs a bit differently. Nonetheless, I would like to encourage everybody really to also read our documents. The country report on Serbia 2021 is on the internet. The country report on Serbia 2022 is currently being drafted. It's likely to be published in October. And read the sections on civil society. Read what we say about pressure, about intimidation, verbal attacks, smear campaigns. So I do think we understand also a bit the situation of civil society in the narrow and broader context. So please do not think that we are naive in this sense. At the same time, we also see positive developments, such as the elections on the 3rd of April, which in our view were more pluralistic, more participate in the election. We will see a different National Assembly, and it will be interesting to see how it will work once it's formed and which voices will be heard there. And then let me also maybe make a critical remark on civil society and movements. On two fronts, or three maybe. The first is, as was mentioned, we have a war. We have war in Europe. Russia's unprovoked and unjustified aggression against Ukraine has brought tremendous suffering in this continent. And what is needed now is that we all stand together. And I can tell you what I personally do not like is that I do not see a unity in this regard. I think it would be, everybody should be encouraged to work together jointly also in Serbia, whatever you think generally about politics here, in order to align Serbia with the position of the European Union, including on sanctions against Russia. So, and here that I do not see happening, one point. Second point, also in particular when it comes to movements on environment. We have opened a cluster of negotiations with Serbia at the end of last year, cluster 3, which covers in particular environmental issues. That would be a fantastic opportunity to engage, to jump on it and hold the government accountable and ask, so where are the reforms on environmental standards in Serbia? Where do you align standards in Serbia to those of the European Union, which are in many accounts the highest in the world? So I see there also a joint agenda, but I don't hear the reference to the European Union in the public discourse in this regard. And the third point, the constitutional referendum. I have heard a lot today about rule of law and the state of affairs here. The constitutional referendum will lead to a more independent judiciary in Serbia. But many actors campaigned, we can disagree, but it's my true belief.
Disagree on this.
Maybe not next year, maybe only in 10 years. And maybe it's also not only a question about laws, but also about implementation and the political culture. But I tell you, to provoke a bit, I don't understand, I understand from a political point of view, but I don't understand from a values-based point of view, the position taken by many in this regard. And yes, I wasn't aware of your request. I certainly did not see it, Ivana. I give you my card, and we get in touch, and then we can talk. And we can talk also what the EU is doing in terms of free legal aid in this country. So there are always several dimensions, but I'm not saying that the state of affairs is perfect on rule of law. And look at the non-papers we are publishing on chapter 23 and 24. I think they give a good state of account also on the problems, and there's a long way to go to work together to achieve the rule of law, state of affairs we would all like to see, even though we come from different points. So that was my intervention and reaction. Thank you.
Shall we go the same order as we did in the first round?
We can, but I thought like there were some willingness
Responses
to talk about these.
He can wait until his turn.
Okay, because okay, then because I would actually redirect from what we heard to actually what Ivana was saying and asking the question at the very beginning on why do citizens trust in the movements, in social movements, and then Ivana used actually the word, among others, it's about the fear that actually social movements address. The fear, I would say, democratic movements address and deal with that. They're constantly there with citizens. Non-democratic movements actually use or misuse the fear in order then to do what they do, building actually deeper distrust and make democracy not actually functional and workable. I would then actually go back into how we can work together in the future, what we need to do actually in order to further empower citizens in like this believing in democracy, and then bringing back actually now I'm talking about Serbia on the right path, and this has to be mutual, and I think that like among civil society organizations in Serbia we really need to actually think more about our constituencies, about our base. Of course, civil society is so pluralistic. The roles are different, but we have to actually work more on solidarity and to work more on this building constituency, and especially in our advocacy work, because it's not enough. I mean, like, Crta works so much on transparency and accountability, increasing transparency, believing that actually making this room for citizens is enough, but we have to reconsider how to actually bridge this gap and think, is it enough to be consistent in what you do in order to build the trust, or you really need to do something more and additional. So again, it was really inspirational, and this is an opportunity to thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you
For this discussion.
Two really small remarks. I mean, I think it's a pity when we find ourselves in a situation where we, the question is who is we, but this kind of a dialogue that we have in the region between the European Union on one hand side and the progressive emancipatory forces on the other hand side, that's really difficult, as basically we are the natural allies, but it's quite obvious that we don't use the same type of language, that we sometimes don't refer to the same perception of reality, and that the mechanisms of approaching certain issues and speaking out might be a bit different. But I think this is just something that we have to embrace and to find basically ways how to unite these streams. And one particular point about this one, looking at Serbia right now, we could go to Adorno's, there is no good, no right life in the wrong one, but I don't think that Vucic's regime can be repaired. This is beyond repair. This is just like Putin's 15 or 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, when we put so much emphasis on cooperation through economic exchange, etc., but it was quite obvious that this is beyond repair, because this is ideologically so deeply entrenched in something that is utterly anti-European, anti-democratic, that there is no point about it, but I think the EU will recognize at a certain moment as the time has changed dramatically. But I mean, this is an open area, but for us to discuss. But something even more important, I think, while this is happening, while these big tectonic shifts are happening around us, and we are going to be hit, and Corona also hit us quite strongly, I think we have to go back to social question and to the social issues, the issue of marginalization of wide parts of the population, basically facing a situation where the preconditions for livable life, as Judy Butler puts it, are being constantly destroyed, basically, step by step. And now comes basically then the question how to unite and how to create an assembly around these vulnerabilities that we have and marginalizations. And I think this is probably the only way in the first step beyond ideological differences to create a kind of common ground for becoming political based on the social question. And this is happening in social movements. I mean, dominantly, I mean, these are the daily based issues. This is the motivation. This is losing the apartment. This is the air, etc., etc. And this is, I think, where we, around this question, we can create a kind of a new unity in our approaches between the European Union and progressive partners, whoever it is, and those that are on the grounds. But unfortunately, for some significant time to come, we will be living what we live now, and this is going to be very depressive and very tough. But I mean, this is something that you have to face it. Sometimes we have to face it.
Let's go for some optimism.
Please. The usual optimist. Well, there was something, when I mentioned Kangarga, there was something back in socialist Yugoslavia called one-party pluralism, right? And it often seems to me that this is the kind of approach that is being developed in Serbia now. And I was also reminded of it with this constitutional referendum, right? It was, as you know, its legitimacy was based on the fact that it was announced, decided upon by practically one party assembly, right? An assembly without opposition. It couldn't have waited for 3 months or 6 months for the new, more pluralist assembly to be formed. It had to be made then. It had to be voted on 3 months before that, right? So obviously that alone, if it was like the best constitutional reform ever, you should be against it. And of course, it's not the best constitutional reform. It's not good at all. And sometimes, I understand that it's sometimes not seen as such from the European perspective. And the same thing happened in Hungary, right? And a Hungarian, now late, Hungarian political economist, János Kornai, wrote on it wonderfully. He said, it is a kind of a puzzle. You know, what Orban is doing, he was talking about Orban, and you can apply it to Vučić. And he said he's making a kind of a puzzle, and all the small parts of the puzzle are these small legal reforms, which kind of look like as something that exists in Europe. But when you see the whole picture, you see that he has built a one-party system, right? Like an authoritarian regime. And this is exactly what happened with the constitutional reform, and what is happening with many such reforms, right? They look like something from the European Union. They copy some law from the European Union, some solution from the European Union. But it is in a very different context. And when you make the whole context, you understand what's happening. But then it might be too late. So, well, I mean, my cheerful comment, that at least in these elections, we had a different kind of political actor. We had a different kind of electoral politics. We had an electoral actor who actually grew from this kind of participatory movements, and this is what I believe is the bringer of change. So, nothing new. Thank you.
I do not have much more to add, except that I don't think that we will have more trust and more democracy if we do not have social and economic rights. I really think that's the basis. And thank you, Mr. Lawrence, for this. We made a constitutional challenge of the law on enforcement, and we proposed some solutions that we thought could benefit, that the people can benefit from. So I would be very willing to tell them more about this to you. And yeah, maybe you can help us achieve more democracy for everyone.
I would like now to just close this session with something, making it a little bit to zoom out from Serbia and its perspective. But you gave me a lot of different materials, and also what we presented is actually this trust which we spoke about. It's not standing alone. Basically, I just wrote to myself, and I don't have here the paper, so I can write to you. Basically, we have a triangle, and the trust is within this triangle, and this triangle is procedures or institutions, whatever would like to see it. It's values and practices. So in this triangle, we operate with trust or distrust. We operate with fear, or we operate with something which is, I don't know how I would say, opposed to fear. Trust is maybe also on the different side of the fear. So basically, if we do not have some alliance, or if we do not have two-way communication between these three pillars, three dots of the triangle, procedure or institutions, practices, how they are implemented in the field, and the values, then basically we are facing with this we're facing. We are facing with authoritarian advancement. We are facing with misusing these procedures, values, and practices for personal or, let's say, small group interest, and then we are wondering what to do. And maybe in this wondering what to do, social movements are the one who can show us a way what to do. And I think this is maybe the something which can be the point of this. When we are stuck, because we are stuck in a way, we have European Union who is not respecting its own values when referring to those who are outside of European Union, even within European Union, then basically we have to do something in order to remind all of us, including local, national, also European level, what are the values we are all struggling for, and this includes also social, economic, and political rights. And I think the social movements are the actors who are reminding us. They are there to remind us what is what we envisaged as a good society. And with that, I would like to end, because I don't know what to say more. I think this is really important, that we need to trust them, at least those who are democratic movements, in order to show us some way, because in a way we are stuck and don't know what to do, and we need to listen. We need really to listen. As we listen those who are coming from the top level, we also need to listen those who are coming bottom up. I think this is the crucial thing. Listening and taking this into consideration is the main recipe to build a better society. So with this, thank you very much for joining us in this last session for today. And we are going to invite you for the evening session in Dorčelplatz, where we are actually discuss more about I would say internal horizontal possibilities of internal and horizontal democracy within political actors. So see you at Dorčelplatz at 7 p.m. Thank you.